In the fall of 1973, over 1,700 factory workers in Meriden, England, were handed their termination notices. But instead of packing their lunchboxes and walking away, they did something unprecedented. They locked the heavy steel gates, welded the barricades shut, and took the entire factory hostage. Just a few years earlier, this same plant was producing the legendary Triumph Bonneville, the undisputed king of the American highways, a roaring symbol of freedom and speed. Now the once deafening assembly line sat in an eerie, barricaded silence. How does a global empire that defined motorcycle culture suddenly collapse into bankruptcy? And more importantly, what drives thousands of ordinary men to risk their freedom and their families' futures to seize a dying factory from their corporate bosses? Step inside the barbed wire of the Great Meriden Blockade. This isn't just the story of a machine. This is the final, desperate battle for the soul of the British motorcycle industry. The ash of the Second World War had barely settled across Europe when Great Britain found itself facing a new, brutal reality. The nation had won the war, but bankrupted itself in the process. To survive the crushing economic aftermath, the British government issued a stark, unforgiving mandate to its manufacturing sector: export or die. Industry was no longer just a matter of commerce, it was a matter of national survival. In the heart of the West Midlands, an area historically known as the anvil of British manufacturing, a sprawling industrial complex was preparing to answer that call. This was the Meriden plant. Originally constructed in 1940 as a shadow factory, to avoid the relentless Luftwaffe bombing raids that devastated the nearby city of Coventry, the Meriden facility was born out of survival instincts. Hidden within the quiet Warwickshire countryside, it was a massive, utilitarian fortress of brick, steel, and glass. When Triumph Motorcycles relocated its production entirely to Meriden after their Coventry works were destroyed in the Blitz, the plant was transformed. It ceased to be a wartime refuge and rapidly evolved into the beating heart of the global motorcycle industry. To step onto the factory floor at Meriden in the late 1940s and 1950s was to step into a cathedral of heavy industry. It was a sensory overload of the highest order. The air was perpetually thick with the metallic tang of hot steel, the acrid bite of welding smoke, and the unmistakable, sweet scent of Castrol R engine oil. The ground trembled beneath the rhythmic, earth-shattering thud of heavy drop forges, stamping out crankshafts and connecting rods. Amidst this deafening industrial symphony were the workers, thousands of men and women who viewed their labor not merely as a job, but as an identity. In post-war Britain, the Meriden worker was a breed apart. These were not simply cogs in a mechanized assembly line. They were craftsmen. The British manufacturing philosophy of the era was deeply rooted in the traditions of the guilds and the artisan. Machinists, fitters, and engineers passed down knowledge from father to son, generation after generation. A Triumph motorcycle was not seamlessly clicked together by precise, automated robotics. It was wrestled into existence by human hands. This culture birthed a unique, almost romantic pride on the shop floor. When a worker painted the gold pinstripe on a petrol tank, it was done entirely by hand, with a steady grip and a specialized brush, making no two tanks exactly identical. When an engine was assembled, it required a process known locally as fettling. Because the factory's tooling was often older and lacked microscopic precision, parts rarely fit together perfectly straight off the milling machines. It took a skilled fitter with a file, a mallet, and years of hard-earned intuition to shave off a fraction of an inch of metal, forcing the components into a perfect, oil-tight marriage. This intense reliance on human skill gave Triumph motorcycles something that machines alone could not manufacture: a soul. The bikes that rolled out of the Meriden gates were loud, aggressive, and possessed a visceral, mechanical heartbeat. They leaked a little oil, They vibrated fiercely at high speeds, but they were undeniably alive. And the world, particularly the affluent and rebellious youth of the United States, could not get enough of them. Triumph became synonymous with a new era of freedom, its twin-cylinder engines echoing across the American West. However, beneath the booming export numbers and the overwhelming pride of the workforce, a dangerous, invisible rot was beginning to take root. The very thing that made Meriden great, its fierce reliance on traditional British craftsmanship, was quietly becoming its fatal flaw. The executives sitting in warm, wood-paneled boardrooms in London and Birmingham looked at the soaring sales charts and drew the wrong conclusions. They believed the profits were a validation of their methods. Consequently, they refused to reinvest those profits back into the factory floor. While other global manufacturers were beginning to explore the concepts of precision engineering, strict quality control, and automated assembly, Meriden was left to age. The machinery grew tired. The lathes became worn. The dies used to stamp metal lost their sharp edges. The proud workers of Meriden were forced to rely even heavier on their personal skills to compensate for the decaying infrastructure around them. They were building world-class machines with tools that belonged in a museum. The pride of the British craftsman had become a heavy curtain, blinding both the management and the workers to a harsh, approaching reality. They believed that heritage and character could forever outpace efficiency and precision. It was an industrial arrogance born of unprecedented success. The Meriden plant was operating at a frantic, glorious pace, entirely unaware that the foundation beneath its roaring assembly lines was already beginning to fracture. In the late 1960s, the mood inside the Meriden factory was one of unshakable, supreme confidence. They were the reigning champions of the motorcycle world, the undisputed masters of the American highway. The Triumph Bonneville was not merely a product, it was a cultural monolith. From the executive suites in London down to the oil-stained factory floor in Warwickshire, there was a collective, blinding belief that their reign would last forever. They were British craftsmen building the best motorcycles on Earth, and the world was begging for more. But across the globe, gathering quietly in the meticulous engineering laboratories of Japan, a storm was brewing. A storm that would not just challenge the British motorcycle industry, but entirely obliterate its foundation. For years, British executives had viewed Japanese motorcycle manufacturers with a mix of mild amusement and outright condescension. Japanese bikes were generally perceived as cheap, small-displacement commuter vehicles. Practical perhaps for navigating crowded Asian cities, but entirely devoid of the power, soul, and fury required to conquer the sprawling American interstates. In 1969, that illusion was permanently shattered. At the Tokyo Motor Show, Honda unveiled a machine that hit the global market like a seismic shockwave, the CB750. It was not just a new motorcycle, it was the birth of an entirely new category, the superbike. The CB750 was a 750 cubic centimeter inline four-cylinder Leviathan. It was a technological marvel that made the beloved Triumph Bonneville look instantly, painfully antiquated. The differences between the two machines were not merely cosmetic, they were existential. When an American rider bought a British twin like the Bonneville, they accepted a certain unspoken contract. They accepted that the bike would vibrate violently at highway speeds, numbing their hands and loosening bolts. They accepted that they would need to place a piece of cardboard under the engine in their garage to catch the inevitable drips of oil. And they accepted that bringing the machine to life required a forceful, practiced kick on a heavy lever, a physical ritual that sometimes resulted in a violently bruised shin. This was simply the price of admission for riding a machine with character. The Honda CB750 demanded none of this suffering. It featured a smooth, impossibly refined four-cylinder engine that hummed effortlessly at high speeds without shaking itself apart. It introduced a revolutionary hydraulic front disc brake that offered precise, fade-free stopping power, making the British drum brakes feel dangerously obsolete. Most devastatingly of all, it featured a simple, magical button on the handlebar, an electric starter. A rider no longer had to wrestle their machine to life in the sweltering summer heat. They simply pushed a button, and the engine purred to life with the precision of a Swiss watch. The Japanese machine did not leak oil. It did not vibrate its own mirrors off. It did not require the rider to be a part-time mechanic. It just worked, flawlessly, every single time. The reaction from the British motorcycle industry's leadership was a textbook study in corporate hubris. Rather than recognizing the CB750 as a lethal, existential threat, the executives overseeing Triumph scoffed at it. Sitting in their comfortable, wood-paneled offices, insulated from the rapidly shifting winds of the global market, they dismissed the Japanese masterpiece as an overly complicated, soulless gimmick. They convinced themselves that the American rider, their core demographic, was fundamentally loyal to the raw, visceral experience of British engineering. They argued that the CB750 was too heavy, too complex, and lacked the deep, aggressive exhaust rumble that real motorcyclists craved. A prevailing sentiment echoed through the British boardrooms. Honda was building two-wheeled appliances, while Triumph was building proper motorcycles with a soul. They believed the threat would simply blow over. But the executives were wrong. Spectacularly, fatally wrong. The American consumer, given the choice between a motorcycle they had to constantly repair and a faster, more reliable machine they could simply ride, abandoned the British twin with devastating speed. The so-called character of the Triumph was suddenly reframed in the minds of buyers as an unacceptable mechanical nuisance. Dealerships across the United States, which had spent the previous decade begging the Meriden factory for any Bonneville inventory they could get their hands on, suddenly found themselves staring at showroom floors dominated by sleek, modern Hondas, Kawasaki's, and Yamahas. Back in Warwickshire, the deafening roar of the drop forges continued. The skilled craftsmen of Meriden kept fettling their parts, painting their gas tanks, and assembling the Bonneville with the exact same pride and dedication they always had. They were completely isolated from the boardroom's arrogance and the shifting tides of the American market. To the men on the line, nothing had changed, but the ground beneath their steel-toed boots was cracking. The golden age had abruptly ended. The plateau had been reached, and the downward slope was steeper than anyone could have imagined. As export orders began to dramatically slow, a wave of panic finally pierced the executive suites in London. The pressure was mounting, and the desperate management was about to make a series of catastrophic, panicked decisions that would push the proud Meriden factory to the very edge of the abyss. By the early 1970s, the panic that had quietly begun to infect the executive suites was metastasizing into a series of catastrophic corporate blunders. The parent company of Triumph, the BSA Group, realized they were rapidly losing ground to the relentless efficiency, reliability, and sheer technological dominance of the Japanese. But instead of looking inward, instead of walking the floor at Meriden, talking to their master craftsmen, and investing in new, desperately needed manufacturing equipment, the board of directors decided to solve the problem by throwing money at a theoretical illusion. They established Umberslade Hall. Located in a sprawling, aristocratic country mansion in Warwickshire, Umberslade Hall was meant to be a state-of-the-art research and development facility. It was intended to centralize the engineering efforts of both BSA and Triumph, ushering the historic brands into a bold new era of modern design. The company poured millions of pounds into the project, hiring hundreds of university-educated engineers, draftsmen, and automotive designers. They filled the grand rooms of the manor with pristine drafting tables, expensive slide rules, and white-coated technicians who had never held a heavy steel file or spent a 12-hour shift inhaling the acrid smoke of a drop forge. This was the genesis of a fatal boardroom disconnect. An invisible but impenetrable wall was erected between the men who designed the motorcycles on paper and the men who actually had to build them in iron. The engineers at Umberslade Hall were brilliant academics, but they operated in a sterile vacuum. They conceptualized intricate, highly theoretical designs that looked magnificent on blueprints, but were entirely divorced from the harsh, mechanical reality of the aging Meriden factory. They did not understand the physical limitations of Meriden's worn-out lathes, the widening tolerances of its stamping presses, or the realities of a high-speed assembly line. They designed components that required microscopic precision that the 1940s-era factory simply could not produce without exhaustive manual modification. When these blueprints were sent down from the aristocratic halls of Umberslade to the gritty, deafening floor of Meriden, the veteran workers were initially baffled and then fiercely resentful. They looked at the new designs and immediately recognized them for what they were: unbuildable. The craftsmen, who had spent decades intuitively compensating for the factory's shortcomings through sheer manual skill, were suddenly being ordered to assemble machines that defied practical mechanics. The resentment festered. The men in overalls felt completely abandoned by the men in suits. The executives in London and the engineers at Umberslade were treating the Meriden workforce not as master craftsmen, but as uneducated laborers who simply needed to follow instructions, no matter how flawed those instructions were. But the true disaster of Umberslade Hall was not just a matter of hurt pride and corporate culture clashing. It was about to manifest in a catastrophic design failure that would bring the legendary Triumph assembly line to a grinding, agonizing halt. The theoretical geniuses had developed a new frame for the beloved Bonneville, and it was about to become one of the most expensive, embarrassing mistakes in British industrial history. The brainchild of the Umberslade Hall engineers was the oil in frame, OIF concept. In an attempt to modernize the Triumph Bonneville and its BSA counterparts, the designers decided to eliminate the traditional, separate oil tank. Instead, they would use the thick, hollow steel spine of the motorcycle's frame itself to hold the hot engine oil. On paper, it was a sleek, innovative way to reduce weight, lower costs, and clean up the visual lines of the machine. In reality, it was an unmitigated industrial disaster. When the first batches of the new oil-in-frame chassis arrived at Meriden, the workers made a horrifying discovery. The engineers at Umberslade had failed to properly account for the height of the fully assembled engine. When the craftsmen attempted to lower the massive 650 cubic centimeter Bonneville engine into the newly designed frame, it simply did not fit. The rocker boxes at the top of the engine smashed directly into the steel backbone of the frame. The assembly line, the very lifeblood of the company, stopped dead. Chaos erupted on the factory floor. Thousands of frames had already been manufactured and delivered. Furthermore, the new frame design inadvertently raised the seat height of the motorcycle so drastically that an average-sized rider could barely touch the ground, a fatal flaw for the American consumer market. The executives in London were paralyzed by the monumental scale of the error. Once again, it fell to the hardened, oil-stained men of Meriden to salvage the company's survival. With their jobs on the line, the workers essentially had to re-engineer the motorcycle on the fly. They resorted to extreme, desperate measures, including removing the rocker boxes, tilting the engine at awkward angles to force it into the frame, and painstakingly reassembling the top end of the motor while it was trapped inside the chassis. A process that was supposed to take minutes now took hours. Productivity plummeted. The factory, which was already struggling to keep pace with the hyper-efficient Japanese output, was now bleeding money with every agonizingly slow unit that crawled off the line. The OIF debacle was just the beginning of a cascading supply chain collapse. Because Umberslade Hall was constantly tinkering with designs and changing specifications without consulting the production floor, the procurement of parts became a nightmare. Meriden found itself in a constant state of agonizing gridlock. They would have thousands of engines ready, but no frames. They would have completed chassis, but no electrical wiring harnesses. Rows upon rows of half-finished motorcycles sat silently in the storage yards, gathering dust while the company lost millions in unfulfilled American orders. By the summer of 1973, the financial hemorrhage was terminal. The BSA Group, once a towering titan of British industry, was collapsing under the crushing weight of its own arrogance and mismanagement. The British government was forced to intervene, desperately attempting to save the domestic motorcycle industry from total annihilation. For the workers at Meriden, the frustration had boiled over into a deep, cold fury. They had watched their beloved factory be driven to the brink of ruin by men who had never turned a wrench. But they had no idea that the ultimate betrayal was still to come. The government's grand rescue plan was about to be finalized, and it did not include salvation for Meriden. It included a death sentence. By the summer of 1973, the once mighty BSA Group had reached the end of its financial rope. The disastrous engineering miscalculations of Umberslade Hall, combined with a total failure to anticipate the sheer scale of the Japanese motorcycle invasion, had drained the corporate coffers dry. The company was hemorrhaging millions of pounds, paralyzed, bemoaned by supply chain gridlock, and sitting on stockpiles of half-finished, unsellable machines. A total collapse was no longer just a grim possibility. It was a matter of weeks. The British government, led by Prime Minister Edward Heath, watched the impending implosion with growing alarm. The political optics of allowing a legendary British manufacturing institution to simply vanish overnight were unacceptable. The government could not afford the massive spike in unemployment, nor could they stomach the national humiliation of surrendering the entire motorcycle industry to the Japanese without a fight. Therefore, a dramatic political and financial intervention was orchestrated behind closed doors in Whitehall. The government's solution was a forced industrial marriage. They offered millions of pounds in financial assistance to broker a merger between the bankrupt BSA Triumph Group and Norton Villiers, the only other surviving British motorcycle manufacturer of any real consequence. The newly formed conglomerate would be called Norton Villiers Triumph, or NVT. To lead this new, precarious empire, the government turned to Dennis Poor. Dennis Poor was the chairman of Manganese Bronze Holdings, the parent company of Norton Villiers. He was a wealthy industrialist, a former Formula One racing driver, and, above all else, a ruthlessly pragmatic financier. Unlike the generational craftsman standing on the floor of the Meriden factory, Poor did not view motorcycles with any particular romanticism. He did not care about the heritage of the Triumph badge, the cherry-bactions, nor did he possess any sentimental attachment to the artisanal methods of the past. To Poor, a factory was simply an equation of input and output. If the math did not balance, the factory had to be fixed, or it had to be destroyed. When Poor took control of NVT, he inherited a sprawling, inefficient mess. He now controlled 3 major manufacturing facilities: the Norton plant in Wolverhampton, the massive BSA facility at Small Heath in Birmingham, and the Triumph plant in Meriden. He quickly realized that the new company was vastly overstaffed and dangerously undercapitalized. To satisfy the terms of the government bailout and give NVT any realistic chance of survival against the Japanese juggernaut, massive cuts had to be made. One of the 3 limbs had to be amputated. From the quiet, sterile environment of his London boardroom, Poor analyzed the data. The Wolverhampton plant was modernizing. The Small Heath facility was sprawling and capable of consolidating production. But Meriden? Meriden was a relic. It was a 1940s shadow factory burdened by ancient machinery, outdated workflows, and a fiercely independent workforce. Furthermore, the land beneath the Meriden factory was becoming incredibly valuable as suburban development pushed outward from Coventry. To the financier, the decision was not a tragedy. It was simply a matter of basic arithmetic. Meriden had to die. In August 1973, the rumors that had been swirling like toxic smoke through the Warwickshire factory finally solidified into a devastating reality. The workers were summoned, and the official announcement was delivered with the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy typical of the era. The NVT board had decided to cease all operations at Meriden. The production of the legendary Triumph Bonneville, the very machine these men had built with their own hands, was to be stripped away from them and relocated to the rival BSA factory at Small Heath. For the workforce, the details of the closure were a brutal, uncompromising death sentence. More than 1,700 men and women were to be made redundant. There would be no phased shutdown, no transition plan, and minimal severance pay. They were simply told that their livelihoods were being liquidated to balance a corporate ledger. The timing could not have been worse. The British economy was plunging into a severe crisis marked by rampant inflation, coal shortages, and industrial unrest. The harsh winter was rapidly approaching, and finding alternative manufacturing work in the Midlands for nearly 2,000 highly specialized middle-aged craftsmen was practically impossible. For many of the men, Meriden was the only workplace they had ever known. Fathers and sons stood side by side on the factory floor, absorbing the reality that their family's financial future had just been erased by a stroke of a pen in London. But the overwhelming emotion that washed over the shop floor was not despair. It was an explosive, white-hot fury. The workers of Meriden felt a profound, unforgivable sense of betrayal. For years, they had bled for triumph. When the executives and engineers at Umberslade Hall had designed the catastrophic oil-in-frame chassis, it was the men on the floor who had sacrificed their time, their energy, and their sanity to physically force the flawed components together. They had covered up management's incompetence with their own sweat and ingenuity, keeping the company afloat through sheer willpower. And this was their reward. The wealthy executives who had run the company into the ground were preserving their own fortunes and their corporate titles, while the craftsmen, who had built the most famous motorcycle in the world, were being thrown onto the freezing streets. Dennis Poor and the NVT board expected the Meriden workforce to behave like traditional, obedient employees. They expected the men to grumble, perhaps stage a brief, localized walkout, and then quietly pack up their toolboxes, assemble the final run of motorcycles, and hand over the keys to the liquidators. They fundamentally misunderstood the men they had just fired. The workers of Meriden had no intention of going quietly into the winter night. The executives had drawn a line in the sand, but the men in the steel-toed boots were about to cross it, igniting one of the most extraordinary industrial uprisings in modern history. In the middle of September 1973, the executives of Norton Villiers Triumph dispatched their representatives to Warwickshire to officially initiate the liquidation of the Meriden plant. The plan was straightforward corporate protocol: halt the assembly lines, begin dismantling the valuable machinery for transport to the Small Heath facility, and physically lock the gates behind the redundant workforce. The management expected anger, perhaps a shouting match with the union stewards, and a begrudging, defeated exit. Instead, they were met with an impenetrable wall of blue-collar defiance. Before the NVT executives could execute their shutdown, the shop stewards of Meriden made a preemptive, fiercely coordinated strike. The workers did not walk out. They walked in, and they refused to leave. Acting with military precision, the men secured the perimeter of the sprawling industrial complex. Heavy iron chains were wrapped around the main gates. Padlocks were snapped shut. Barricades constructed from scrap steel and wooden pallets were hastily erected and welded into place across the loading bays. Delivery trucks attempting to enter or leave the premises were physically blocked by human walls of angry, determined craftsmen. Within a matter of hours, The corporate hierarchy had been entirely inverted. The men in the boardrooms no longer controlled the Meriden factory. The men in the steel-toed boots did. The sheer audacity of the takeover sent shockwaves through the British industrial establishment. This was not a standard labor dispute or a temporary picket line. This was a total occupation of a major manufacturing asset. More importantly, it was a strategic masterstroke of leverage. When the workers chained the gates shut, they did not just trap the aging machinery inside. They successfully took hostage thousands of completed, ready-to-ship Triumph Bonneville motorcycles that were sitting in the factory's holding yards. Those motorcycles represented millions of pounds in export revenue that the teetering NVT conglomerate desperately needed to survive the winter. Dennis Poor and his board of directors suddenly realized they were entirely paralyzed. They could not sell the bikes because they could not physically reach them. The workers had seized the company's absolute most vital financial artery. Inside the compound, the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of fear, adrenaline, and unprecedented solidarity. Over 1,000 men were now occupying a massive, silent factory. The deafening rhythm of the drop forges and the whine of the lathes had been replaced by the quiet, tense hum of men organizing a prolonged siege. Committees were instantly formed to manage sanitation, coordinate food deliveries from sympathetic local businesses, and establish a 24-hour security perimeter. The executives in London assumed the occupation would be a brief, chaotic flash in the pan. They believed that without their weekly paychecks, the workers would quickly succumb to the harsh financial realities of providing for their families, break ranks, and surrender the facility. Management employed a strategy of attrition, deciding to simply freeze the workers out, confident that the impending British winter would accomplish what corporate mandates could not. But the NVT board had fundamentally misjudged the deep-seated pride and the unbreakable communal bonds of the Meriden workforce. These men were not merely defending a paycheck, they were defending their identity, their heritage, and their absolute right to exist as master mechanics in a world that was rapidly trying to discard them. They dug in, prepared to starve before they would ever hand over the keys. As 1973 bled into 1974, the Meriden blockade descended into a grueling, bitter war of attrition. The broader context of the United Kingdom at this time was one of total economic and social chaos. The country was crippled by a national miners' strike, severe coal shortages, and rampant inflation. To conserve energy, the British government had instituted the infamous 3-day week, strictly limiting the electricity usage of commercial users. Widespread blackouts plunged entire cities into darkness. Against this apocalyptic national backdrop, the occupation of Meriden held firm, transforming the factory into a surreal, self-sustaining fortress. The winter was brutally cold, and the factory floor, no longer heated by the massive industrial ovens or the friction of heavy machinery, became an icebox. The occupying workers huddled around improvised braziers, built from oil drums, burning scrap wood and coal to stave off frostbite. Their financial situation was dire. The men were surviving on meager strike pay from their unions, supplemented by donations from sympathetic factory workers across the Midlands, who viewed the Meriden standoff as the ultimate front line in the battle against corporate greed. Wives and local community members organized massive soup kitchens, smuggling hot food and supplies over the fences. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological discipline of the workers was nothing short of extraordinary. The media, anticipating riots, vandalism, and the destruction of the hostage motorcycles, swarmed the gates of Meriden. The NVT management pushed a narrative that the occupying workers were a dangerous, radicalized mob illegally squatting on private property. But when journalists were finally allowed brief glimpses inside the perimeter, they found the exact opposite. The Meriden craftsmen were treating the factory with a level of reverence and care that bordered on religious. They were not vandals. They were custodians. The factory floors were swept spotless every single day. The expensive machinery was meticulously oiled, greased, and covered with heavy tarpaulins to prevent rust in the damp winter air. The thousands of completed Triumph Bonnevilles sitting in the yard were routinely polished and rotated to prevent the tires from developing flat spots. The workers maintained strict patrols to ensure that not a single wrench, spark plug, or piece of copper wire was stolen. This profound display of discipline completely shifted the tide of public opinion. The British public did not see a radical mob. They saw highly skilled, respectable working-class men desperately trying to protect a great British institution from being systematically destroyed by out-of-touch financiers. As the standoff dragged into its second year, the brutal reality of the stalemate began to crush the NVT conglomerate. Dennis Poor could not access his inventory, and the entire Norton Villiers Triumph operation was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. The strategy of starving the workers out had failed spectacularly. The men of Meriden had endured the freezing cold, the poverty, and the intense psychological pressure, and they had not yielded a single inch of ground. Finally, backed into a corner and facing total corporate liquidation, the management and the government were forced to the negotiating table. The workers had proven they could hold the factory, but now an even more radical idea began to take root among the strike leaders. If management was fundamentally incapable of running Triumph efficiently, and the men on the floor knew exactly how to build the motorcycles, why shouldn't the workers simply own the factory themselves? The impossible siege was ending, but an even more dangerous experiment was about to begin. In March 1975, after 18 agonizing months of freezing temperatures, relentless media scrutiny, and crippling financial hardship, the heavy steel gates of the Meriden factory finally swung open. But it was not the corporate liquidators who walked through them. It was the workers. In a stunning, unprecedented reversal of fortune, the men who had built the barricades had actually won the war. The political landscape of Great Britain had shifted beneath the feet of the NVT conglomerate. A newly elected Labour government, sympathetic to the plight of the working class and driven by the fiercely pro-union Secretary of State for Industry, Tony Benn, decided to intervene. The government brokered a complex, highly controversial financial deal, providing a loan of nearly £5 million to allow the workers to buy the factory outright from the crumbling Norton Villiers Triumph empire. The Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative was officially born. It was an industrial revolution in miniature. There were no longer any wealthy shareholders, distant board members, or aristocratic engineers handing down impossible mandates from country estates. The men who swept the floors, operated the heavy lathes, and painted the gas tanks were now the sole, undisputed masters of their own destiny. They operated on a radical system of absolute equality. Every single member of the cooperative, from the managing director to the newest apprentice sweeping the loading bays, was paid the exact same flat wage. The euphoria that washed over the Warwickshire complex was intoxicating. The media hailed them as working-class heroes. To prove their capability to a deeply skeptical corporate world, the newly formed cooperative did not just restart the dormant assembly lines. They immediately sought to improve their flagship product. The era of the 650 cubic centimeters T120 was over. The workers turned their full, undivided attention to its muscular successor, the Triumph Bonneville T140. The T140 was a 750 cubic centimeter Declaration of Independence. The Meriden craftsman took the iconic parallel twin engine and bored it out, granting it significantly more torque and raw pulling power to satisfy the demanding American highway rider. They finally discarded the antiquated drum brakes that had plagued earlier models, equipping the machine with modern hydraulic disc brakes on both the front and rear wheels. They integrated a much-needed 5-speed gearbox, allowing the engine to cruise comfortably at high speeds without vibrating the rider to the bone. When the very first cooperative-built T-140 Bonnevilles rolled off the assembly line and out into the crisp English air, it felt like a miraculous resurrection. The machines were magnificent. They were arguably the most refined, well-assembled motorcycles the Meriden plant had produced in a decade, built by men whose very livelihoods, homes, and personal honor depended on every single bolt being tightened to perfection. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that the working class had done the impossible. They had defeated the corporate elite. The Court de Turinquid saved a beloved British institution and proven that traditional craftsmanship still had a place in the modern world. But the triumphant, throaty roar of the T-140 engines was masking a hollow, terrifying reality. The Meriden Cooperative had won the battle for the factory, but they had inherited a poisoned chalice. The euphoria of their political victory quickly evaporated, replaced by the crushing, unforgiving physics of international capitalism. The core of their crisis was structural starvation. The £5 million government loan sounded like a massive fortune on the front pages of the national newspapers. But in the hyper-expensive realm of heavy global manufacturing, it was little more than a temporary bandage. A significant portion of that money immediately went to NVT just to purchase the physical premises and the intellectual property rights to build the motorcycles. By the time the cooperative actually restarted the assembly line and purchased raw materials, their operational capital was dangerously depleted. Furthermore, the terms of their independence were brutally restrictive. For the first 2 years of the cooperative's existence, they did not even have the legal right to sell their own motorcycles directly to the public or to international distributors. They were contractually forced to sell the T-140s entirely through NVT's existing collapsing sales network. Dennispour's failing conglomerate still controlled the pipeline to America, effectively suffocating Meriden's ability to generate steady cash flow. By the time NVT finally went completely bankrupt in 1977 and Meriden won the right to market their own bikes independently, severe financial damage had already been done. Inside the factory walls, the radical egalitarianism that had forged such unbreakable solidarity during the winter blockade was now becoming a severe operational liability. The cooperative was managed by a committee of workers. While this ensured fairness and absolute transparency, it was a disastrously slow way to run a highly competitive international business. The men of Meriden were absolute masters of mechanics, but they were not masters of macroeconomics, global supply chain logistics, or currency hedging. When swift, ruthless financial decisions were required to counter the aggressive, rapid-fire technological advancements of Honda and Yamaha, the Meriden Committee debated. They were forced to navigate complex international marketing strategies with no formal corporate training, relying on instinct rather than data. The aging infrastructure of the factory, the very machines that had desperately needed replacement a decade earlier, continued to break down. But there was absolutely no capital available to invest in modernizing the plant. They were trapped in a 1940s production facility, armed with 1960s tooling, trying to fight a late 1970s economic war. The men on the shop floor worked themselves to the bone, voluntarily taking pay cuts and working massive amounts of unpaid overtime just to keep the lights on and the parts moving. Their dedication was heroic, but heroism cannot balance a ledger. The T-140 was a beautiful, soulful motorcycle, but it was being built by a company that had zero financial ammunition. The brilliant false dawn was rapidly fading, and a brutal economic winter was about to return with a vengeance. By the dawn of the 1980s, the raw, idealistic fervor that had fueled the early days of the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative was completely exhausted. The men on the factory floor had proven their point to the world. They could govern themselves, they could run a massive industrial facility without aristocratic executives, and they could still build a magnificent motorcycle in the form of the Bonneville T-140. But pride, No matter how fiercely held, cannot purchase raw steel, and solidarity cannot pay down a compounding national loan. As the new decade began, a terrifying realization settled over the Warwickshire plant. The enemy was no longer the arrogance of corporate management. The enemy was the cold, unforgiving mathematics of global economics. The cooperative had been born with a financial noose already tied around its neck. The initial multi-million-pound government loan that allowed the workers to purchase the factory from the liquidators was never a grant. It was a high-interest debt that demanded regular, agonizingly large repayments. From the very first day of independent production, Meriden was operating in a state of severe capital starvation. Every pound of profit they managed to squeeze out of a finished motorcycle was immediately swallowed by debt servicing, leaving absolutely nothing for research, development, or the modernization of their crumbling 1940s infrastructure. However, the final lethal blow to the Meriden Cooperative did not come from within the factory walls. It came from the international currency exchange markets. In 1979, the British political and economic landscape underwent a massive seismic shift. Margaret Thatcher ascended to the role of Prime Minister, inheriting a nation crippled by rampant inflation and industrial unrest. To combat the inflation, her government aggressively raised interest rates to punishingly high levels. Simultaneously, the massive commercial extraction of North Sea oil began to flood the British economy with new capital. This combination of high interest rates and petrodollars had a spectacular, devastating side effect. It artificially hyperinflated the value of the British pound sterling against the United States dollar. For a domestic business, a strong currency might have been a point of national pride. But for an export-dependent manufacturing facility like Meriden, it was an absolute death sentence. Triumph's entire survival model relied on selling motorcycles to the United States. Almost overnight, the soaring value of the pound meant that the price of a Triumph Bonneville in American showrooms skyrocketed. A motorcycle that was once a reasonably priced, character-filled alternative to the Japanese superbikes was suddenly priced as a luxury commodity. The math was brutally simple, and it was entirely out of the workers' control. An American rider walking into a dealership in 1980 was faced with a stark, undeniable reality. On one side of the showroom floor sat the Triumph T140, a beautiful, soulful machine, but one built on aging architecture, prone to minor oil leaks and demanding constant mechanical attention. Its price tag had been massively inflated by the exchange rate. On the other side of the showroom sat a fleet of brand-new Japanese motorcycles from Honda, Yamaha, and Kawasaki. These machines featured electric starters, digital ignitions, multi-cylinder engines that ran with flawless, vibration-free precision, and a price tag that was often hundreds of dollars cheaper than the British twin. The American market, historically the savior of the British motorcycle industry, effectively vanished. Orders plummeted. The vital flow of U.S. dollars, which the cooperative desperately needed to pay its workforce and service its government loans, evaporated into thin air. Back in Warwickshire, the reaction of the workers was a heartbreaking display of working-class sacrifice. They were men of the forge and the lathe. They fundamentally believed that there was no problem on earth that could not be solved by simply working harder. When the financial ledgers began to bleed red, the cooperative committee called emergency meetings on the shop floor. To keep the company alive, the workers voluntarily voted to slash their own wages. When that was not enough, they agreed to work a 4-day week and then a 3-day week, sacrificing their family's financial security for the survival of the plant. They worked in freezing conditions, refusing to turn on the massive factory heaters to save on utility bills. They scavenged spare parts from abandoned, rusting machinery in the scrap yards rather than buying new components. They cannibalized their own history just to keep the assembly line inching forward. But sheer willpower and manual labor are powerless against macroeconomic forces. A man with a file and a wrench cannot outwork international exchange rates, and he cannot outmuscle compounding interest. By 1981, the financial situation had deteriorated into a permanent, suffocating crisis. The Meriden compound, once a roaring cathedral of British industry, was beginning to look like a ghost town. Entire wings of the massive brick facility were shut down, plunged into darkness to save electricity. The remaining workforce, now drastically reduced in numbers, moved through the echoing halls with a grim, hollow determination. They were no longer building motorcycles to conquer the world. They were building motorcycles simply to survive one more week. The cooperative had successfully fought off the corporate elite, and they had survived the freezing winter blockade. But they could not fight the Bank of England, and they could not fight the relentless, hyper-efficient march of Japanese engineering. The weight of the debt and the crushing strength of the pound had finally broken the back of the Meriden experiment. The end was no longer a possibility. It was a rapidly approaching certainty. By 1983, the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative was no longer a functioning business. It was a patient on life support, and the financial monitors were rapidly flatlining. The brutal combination of a hyperinflated British pound, crippling government debt, and a severe global recession had completely drained the factory's lifeblood. There were no more emergency loans to be negotiated. There were no more corners to cut, no more operational efficiencies to find, and no more wages to slash. The international creditors and the Bank of England were no longer interested in the romanticism of the working-class struggle. They wanted their money, and Meriden simply had nothing left to give. The decision to finally declare bankruptcy was not handed down by a distant, insulated board of directors in a London high-rise. It was a decision made by the workers themselves, a bitter concession discussed and voted upon on the very shop floor they had fought so fiercely to control. It was an agonizing realization that sheer human willpower and traditional mechanical skill were ultimately no match for the crushing weight of macroeconomic forces. The cooperative had not failed at building motorcycles. They had failed to survive a rigged global financial system. The atmosphere inside the vast, aging industrial complex during those final weeks was fundamentally different from the explosive, adrenaline-fueled fury of the 1973 blockade. Back then, there was righteous anger and a defiant belief that they could change their own destiny. Now, exactly a decade later, there was only a profound, suffocating sorrow. The fight had been entirely drained out of them. As the final dwindling orders were fulfilled, the factory began to die piece by piece. The massive drop forges, which had slammed red-hot steel into crankshafts with earth-shattering force for over 40 years, were powered down for good. The sudden absence of their rhythmic, concussive thud left a sickening, hollow silence in the Warwickshire air. The heavy stamping presses were halted. The lathe spun to a slow, permanent stop. One by one, the vast, echoing halls of the Meriden plant were plunged into darkness. The assembly of the very last Triumph Bonnevilles was treated not as a manufacturing process, but as a somber, deeply reverent ritual. The men assigned to the final run of machines did not rush. Every nut was tightened with deliberate care. Every engine was hand-fettled with the accumulated intuition of a lifetime spent in grease and steel. They were not just building motorcycles. They were constructing their own mechanical epitaphs. When the final T140 rolled off the end of the line, its parallel twin engine was fired up for the very first time. The familiar, throaty rumble echoed through the near-empty factory, a solitary, defiant roar before the inevitable silence. What happened next defined the true character of the Meriden workforce. Even in the face of total defeat, personal financial ruin, and impending unemployment, they did not resort to vandalism. They did not smash the windows, burn the blueprints, or sabotage the aging machinery that had ultimately failed to save them. Instead, they behaved exactly like the master craftsmen they were. In their final hours on the clock, the remaining men took clean rags, an industrial solvent, and meticulously wiped down the equipment. They heavily oiled the exposed metal of the lathes and milling machines to prevent rust. They swept the factory floors until they were completely immaculate. They prepared the sprawling plant for its own funeral with absolute, unyielding dignity. Then came the moment they had spent a decade bleeding to prevent. The men gathered their personal tools, the specialized files, wrenches, and mallets that had been handed down from fathers to sons, and placed them into their battered metal toolboxes. They took off their oil-stained overalls for the final time. In small, quiet groups, they walked down the long, concrete corridors, their heavy steel-toed boots echoing against the brick walls. 10 years earlier, these same men had welded the steel gates shut to keep the corporate liquidators out, risking their freedom to protect their heritage. Now, in the bleak autumn of 1983, they were the ones turning the keys. They walked out past the barbed wire and the rusted chain-link fences, stepping into a cold, deeply uncertain future. The massive iron gates were pulled shut behind them and locked with a heavy, definitive clank. The heartbeat of British motorcycling had finally stopped. The Meriden factory, once a roaring cathedral of industry that had supplied the American highways with an unstoppable fleet of mechanical legends, was entirely silent. The empire had fallen, not with an explosion of corporate restructuring, but with the quiet, devastating click of a padlock. By 1984, the physical remnants of the Great Meriden experiment were being systematically erased from the Warwickshire landscape. The corporate liquidators had sold off whatever machinery of value remained, the lathes, the presses, the specialized tools, shipping them out to auction houses or scrap yards. Once the factory was hollowed out, the heavy demolition equipment moved in. The massive brick walls of the 1940s shadow factory, which had withstood the anxiety of the Second World War and the explosive cultural shifts of the 1960s, offered little resistance to modern bulldozers. The demolition was swift and unsentimental. The ground beneath the plant, soaked deep with decades of castor oil, metal shavings, and the sweat of 3 generations of master craftsmen, was churned up and paved over. In a profound irony that perfectly mirrored the economic transformation of Great Britain in the 1980s, the towering cathedral of heavy industry was replaced by a quiet, sterile suburban housing estate. Today, if you walk through that neighborhood, the only ghosts of the roaring past are the street signs. Families live on Bonneville Close, park their cars on Trophy Drive, and walk their dogs down Daytona Drive. The earth no longer trembles from the concussive force of drop forges. The deafening mechanical heartbeat of the British motorcycle industry has been permanently replaced by the quiet hum of lawnmowers and suburban domesticity. From a strictly financial perspective, the story of the Meriden Cooperative is often filed away as a failure. Corporate historians, and economists look at the ultimate bankruptcy in 1983 and point to it as proof that an egalitarian, worker-run factory could not survive the ruthless realities of international capitalism. They argue that the men of Meriden were stubborn traditionalists fighting an unwinnable war against Japanese efficiency, government debt, and global exchange rates. On a balance sheet, the experiment undeniably collapsed. But to view the Meriden blockade and the subsequent cooperative solely through the lens of profit and loss is to entirely miss the point of the struggle. The men who chained those gates shut in 1973 did not do so because they possessed a flawless macroeconomic business plan. They did it because they were pushed to the absolute edge of their dignity. They rejected the corporate mandate that treated human beings, master craftsmen who had dedicated their entire lives to a single, highly specialized trade, as disposable assets that could simply be liquidated to correct a boardroom error. By seizing the factory, the workers of Meriden bought themselves a decade of agency. They refused to die quietly in the winter of 1973. Instead, they resurrected their beloved assembly lines, engineered the magnificent Triumph T140, and proved to the world that they were fundamentally capable of governing themselves. They worked through freezing winters, took voluntary pay cuts, and sacrificed their own financial stability to keep their community and their pride intact. They did not just build motorcycles, they built a monument to working-class defiance. The fall of Meriden was not an isolated tragedy. It was the canary in the coal mine for the broader deindustrialization of the West. It foreshadowed a painful era where making physical things with skilled human hands was rapidly replaced by service economies and offshore manufacturing. The unique, intuitive skill of fettling metal, passed down from father to son, was rendered obsolete by robotics and digital precision. The Triumph name itself did not die. The intellectual property was eventually purchased by British billionaire John Bloor, who would go on to build a brand new, highly modernized, and wildly successful Triumph factory in Hinckley years later. The badge survived, and it thrives today. But the soul of the classic British motorcycle, the loud, vibrating, oil-leaking, handcrafted machine that conquered the American highways and defined the rebellious spirit of the 1960s, died in the dust of the Meriden demolition. The men of Meriden may have ultimately lost their factory to the overwhelming forces of global economics, but they won a much deeper, permanent victory. They guaranteed that the story of the Triumph Bonneville would not end with a cowardly corporate surrender. It ended with a fight. And as long as those classic twin-cylinder engines still rumble down the open highways, the legend of the workers who refuse to lose will never truly be silenced. The story of Triumph Meriden is often reduced to a cautionary tale of economic inevitability. Boardroom executives and financial analysts will point to the devastating Japanese competition, the antiquated machinery, and the crushing weight of a hyper-inflated pound sterling as absolute proof that the Meriden Motorcycle Cooperative was doomed from the very moment it began. And on paper, they are right. You cannot fight macroeconomic gravity with a steel file, a wrench, and working-class solidarity. But history is not written exclusively in ledgers and profit margins. It is written in the blood, sweat, and absolute defiance of the people who actually turn the gears of industry. The Great Meriden Blockade remains one of the most profound moments in manufacturing history because it fundamentally challenged the corporate narrative. When the aristocratic board of Norton Villiers Triumph decided to casually liquidate a heritage institution to balance their books, the craftsmen of Warwickshire refused to be treated as disposable lines on a spreadsheet. They took a dying factory and through sheer, uncompromising willpower, forced it to breathe again. They sacrificed their wages, their comfort, and their youth to protect the dignity of their trade. Today, modern Triumph motorcycles are built in pristine, hyper-efficient factories, guided by robotics and microscopic digital tolerances. They are magnificent, reliable machines that dominate the global market, but they do not vibrate with the exact same raw, defiant soul that was hammered into the T140 Bonneville by the desperate, proud men of the cooperative. The Meriden era represents the final, glorious stand of traditional British craftsmanship before it was permanently swallowed by the cold, calculated efficiency of the modern globalized world. They may have lost the factory, and the bulldozers may have erased their barricades, but they ensured that the heart of British motorcycling went out fighting. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the rust and ruin of industrial history. If you found the story of the Meriden workers as compelling as we do, please consider leaving a comment below with your thoughts on their historic blockade and subscribe to the channel as we continue to explore the rise, fall, and lasting legacy of the world's greatest industrial empires.